December 15, 1944. The dense forests of the Ardennes region in Belgium stood silent under a heavy blanket of snow, the temperature hovering just below freezing as dawn broke through the skeletal trees. At exactly 0600 hours, Corporal Thomas Mitchell of the United States Army's 2nd Infantry Division crouched in a foxhole barely 3 feet deep, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed the fog-shrouded landscape before him. He believed, like the 30 men of his isolated platoon, that their position along this quiet sector was merely a temporary assignment, a brief respite from the intense combat they had endured since landing in France 6 months earlier. How terribly wrong they were about to discover they had been. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Mitchell could not have known in those early morning hours was that within the next 12 hours, his understanding of combat, his resourcefulness under impossible circumstances, and a simple length of rope would transform him from an ordinary rifleman into the man who would save 30 lives and alter the course of a major operation through ingenuity that no military manual had ever taught. Thomas Mitchell had grown up in the mountains of Western Virginia, the second son of a coal miner who had taught his boys how to hunt white-tailed deer through the dense Appalachian forests. At 23 years old, Mitchell stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, with lean muscles hardened by 2 years of military service and the kind of patience that came from spending long hours motionless in a tree stand, waiting for game. Beside him in the foxhole sat Private First Class Robert Jensen, a farm boy from Iowa, who had joined the Army 3 months after his 18th birthday. Along the defensive line, spread across approximately 800 meters, the remainder of 1st Platoon occupied hastily dug positions in the frozen ground. Lieutenant Christopher Walsh, their platoon commander, was a 25-year-old graduate of the Virginia Military Institute who had positioned his command post in a partially collapsed farmhouse roughly 200 meters behind the forward line. The intelligence report suggested nothing unusual about their sector. The German forces opposing them were believed to be depleted units, exhausted from months of retreat and lacking the strength for significant offensive operations. This assessment represented one of the most catastrophic failures of military intelligence in the entire conflict. At 0630 hours, Private Jensen stopped humming. In the eerie silence that followed, Mitchell heard something that made his blood run cold. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder, but steadily grew in volume and intensity. The sound came from the east, from deep within the fog-shrouded forest. Engines, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Mitchell grabbed the field telephone and cranked the handle urgently. Walsh answered on the second ring. Then Mitchell said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest, "Lieutenant, we have engine noises approaching from the east. Multiple vehicles. It sounds big, sir." What neither Mitchell nor Walsh knew was that at that very moment, along an 85-kilometer front, approximately 200,000 soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 armored vehicles, were beginning the largest offensive operation mounted since the early years of the conflict. 1st Platoon's tiny sector now sat directly in the path of this massive assault. By 0700 hours, the fog had begun to lift. What Mitchell saw through his rifle sight made his mouth go dry. Moving through the trees approximately 600 meters to his front were columns of infantry, advancing in loose formation with practiced efficiency. Behind them came the darker shapes of armored vehicles. Jensen whispered, his voice cracking slightly, "Dear God, Tom, there must be hundreds of them." Mitchell estimated the approaching force at roughly 500 infantry with armored support, vastly outnumbering 1st Platoon's 32 men. But Lieutenant Walsh faced an impossible situation. Battalion headquarters had ordered him to hold his position at all costs, to buy time for units further west to establish defensive lines. If his platoon abandoned their positions, an 800-meter gap would open in the defensive line. At 0715 hours, Walsh gathered his 3 squad leaders. Among them was Sergeant William Harrison, a career soldier who had served in campaigns across multiple theaters. Harrison had a grizzled face that made him look older than his 31 years. Said Sergeant Harrison, his voice gravelly from years of shouting orders, "Sir, we cannot stop them in a straight fight. We do not have the ammunition, we do not have the anti-tank weapons, and we do not have the manpower. But we might be able to slow them down if we get creative. Harrison explained his idea rapidly. If 1st Platoon abandoned their prepared positions and moved into the hills overlooking the valley, they could use the terrain to offset the enemy's numerical superiority. Walsh saw the logic and made his decision. Each squad would move independently to assigned positions in the hills. Mitchell and Jensen were assigned to 2nd Squad, under Sergeant Harrison's direct command. As they gathered their gear, Mitchell noticed a coil of rope among the supplies. On impulse, he grabbed it and slung it over his shoulder. The rope measured approximately 50 meters in length and was designed to support loads of up to 300 pounds. At 07:45 hours, 1st Platoon began their displacement. Mitchell, carrying his M1 Garand rifle and the coil of rope, followed Sergeant Harrison up a steep hillside. They reached their position at 0800 hours, just as enemy soldiers began probing the abandoned American foxholes. Mitchell found himself on a hillside, approximately 60 meters above the valley floor, positioned behind a fallen tree with a clear view of the natural corridor below. What Mitchell observed revealed the true scale of the operation. The initial force was merely the advance guard. Behind them came a seemingly endless stream of soldiers, vehicles, and equipment. Mitchell counted 12 armored vehicles with supply trucks, artillery pieces, and command vehicles stretching back as far as he could see. At 0845 hours, Lieutenant Walsh's voice crackled over the radio, giving the order to begin harassing fire. 1st Platoon would fire a few shots and then immediately displace to alternate positions. The goal was to create confusion and delay the advance. Mitchell chose his target carefully, an officer based on his position near the front of a column. Mitchell squeezed the trigger, feeling the familiar recoil. Through his sight, he saw the officer stumble and fall. The effect was immediate. Soldiers dove for cover, officers shouted orders, and the entire advance halted. Return fire erupted, but Sergeant Harrison had chosen positions well. The Americans were firing from elevated positions with good cover. For approximately 15 minutes, 1st Platoon maintained their harassing fire. Mitchell fired 12 rounds, estimating he had hit at least 6 enemy soldiers. But the enemy forces were too numerous. They began organizing proper assaults up the hillsides. At 09:15 hours, Harrison ordered his men to break contact and displace further west. The withdrawal was chaotic. Mitchell and Jensen stuck close to Harrison, moving through the forest in short rushes between cover. Behind them, they could hear enemy soldiers crashing through the underbrush in pursuit. Harrison led his increasingly scattered squad into a small ravine filled with dense underbrush. Mitchell counted heads. 2nd Squad had started with 9 men. Now gathered in the ravine, he counted only 6, including Harrison. Harrison attempted to contact Lieutenant Walsh by radio, but received only static. They were effectively cut off. Said Harrison, "Listen up. We are going to work our way west through this ravine. Stay low, stay quiet, and stay together." As they prepared to move, Mitchell suddenly held up his hand for silence. Voices, German voices, coming from directly ahead. A column of approximately 20 enemy soldiers moved into view, following the same ravine. Mitchell held his breath as they passed within 10 meters of his position. The Germans passed without detecting them, but their presence blocked Harrison's planned route. They were trapped. For nearly an hour, 2nd Squad remained hidden while enemy forces moved through the area. Mitchell inventoried his remaining ammunition. He had 4 8-round clips left, a total of 32 rounds. At 10:45 hours, the situation changed. Mitchell observed a large enemy force, perhaps 200 soldiers, forming up in the valley below. Officers organized the troops into formation. This was an assault force being prepared to continue the advance westward, directly toward American positions that were probably still unaware of the breakthrough. He crawled over to where Sergeant Harrison was observing the same scene. Said Mitchell quietly, "Sergeant, we have to slow them down somehow." Harrison lowered his binoculars and looked at Mitchell with skepticism. Said the sergeant, his voice barely above a whisper, "Corporal, there are 6 of us and about 200 of them. I am open to suggestions, but we do not have the firepower to even inconvenience a force that size." Mitchell looked at the enemy formation, then at the terrain, then at the coil of rope still slung over his shoulder. An idea began forming, born from years of hunting in mountain forests, said Mitchell slowly. Sergeant, what if we do not try to fight them? What if we just make them think the entire hillside is full of Americans waiting to ambush them? Harrison's eyes narrowed with interest. Said the sergeant. Keep talking. Mitchell explained rapidly. The enemy force was organized but also cautious after the earlier harassing fire. They knew American forces were somewhere in the forest, but did not know exactly where or in what strength. If 2nd Squad could create the illusion of a much larger force, the enemy might delay their advance. The key to the deception was the rope and the terrain. If they could string the rope across certain key points and attach equipment to it, they might create enough visual and audible cues to convince the enemy that Americans were moving in strength through the area. Harrison considered the plan for less than 30 seconds before nodding. Said the sergeant, It is crazy, but I have seen crazier things work. Show me what you need. For the next 20 minutes, Mitchell worked with desperate speed. He identified 3 positions along the hillside where the rope could be strung between trees in a way that would be visible from the valley below. At each position, he attached items of equipment, helmets, empty canteens, anything that would move in the wind and catch the eye of observers. But the real genius involved sound as much as sight. He positioned his 5 squadmates at intervals along the hillside and instructed them to make noise at irregular intervals, calling out false commands, moving through brush, firing single shots in different directions. The goal was to create the acoustic impression of a much larger force. At 11:15 hours, Mitchell pulled the rope taut at the first position, causing a helmet attached to it to bob into view. Almost immediately, he heard shouts from enemy soldiers who spotted the movement. Jensen, positioned 60 meters away, fired a single shot in a different direction. Another squad member shouted a false command. The effect was immediate. Officers began shouting orders, soldiers scrambled for cover, and the organized advance dissolved into defensive positions. Mitchell moved to his 2nd rope position and repeated the process. More movement, more noise, more confusion. For nearly 2 hours, Mitchell and 2nd Squad maintained this elaborate ruse. They moved constantly, creating the impression of a significant American force. The 6 men generated the noise and movement patterns of perhaps 40 or 50 soldiers, and the enemy forces, already nervous, interpreted every sound as confirmation of a major threat. The enemy responded by bringing up reinforcements and conducting reconnaissance. 3 times small patrols advanced up the slopes. Each time Mitchell's squad would fire a few shots from unexpected angles, then displace. The rope installations, shifting with the wind, drew additional enemy attention and fire. At 1300 hours, Mitchell observed something that made his heart race. The large enemy formation that had been preparing to advance westward was instead digging defensive positions in the valley. They had abandoned their offensive posture. Sergeant Harrison, observing the same scene, allowed himself a tight smile. Said the sergeant, his voice carrying amazement. Mitchell, I do believe you just stopped an entire battalion with 6 men and a rope. But they remained deep behind enemy lines with limited ammunition. The deception could only last so long. At 13:30 hours, Mitchell heard a sound that was distinctly different. American engines coming from the west. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of American armored vehicles moving into positions roughly 2 kilometers away. Reinforcements had arrived. Harrison immediately recognized the significance. If they could reach the American forces and provide intelligence on enemy positions, it could turn their small delaying action into a major victory. The problem was communication. Harrison's radio still could not raise any American frequencies. They needed to physically reach friendly lines. Mitchell proposed circling north through the forest to reach friendly lines from an unexpected direction. Harrison agreed, and at 1400 hours, 2nd Squad began their movement north. They abandoned the rope installations, leaving them in place to continue the deception, and moved carefully through the forest. The next 3 hours tested every bit of skill and luck the 6 men possessed. Multiple times they hid as enemy patrols passed nearby. Once, they crawled on their bellies for nearly 200 meters to avoid an enemy observation post. Jensen twisted his ankle badly, forcing him to lean on Mitchell for support. At 16:45 hours, as winter darkness began falling, Second Squad finally made contact with American forces. A patrol from the 3rd Armored Division nearly fired on them before Harrison managed to identify his unit. The patrol's lieutenant listened with growing amazement as Harrison rapidly briefed him on enemy positions, strength, and intentions. The lieutenant immediately radioed Harrison's intelligence back to his battalion commander. Within the hour, American artillery began falling on the enemy positions that Second Squad had identified. The barrage was devastating because Mitchell had carefully noted landmarks and could provide precise locations. Fire missions directed by their intelligence accounted for significant enemy losses and completely disrupted the planned advance. Perhaps more importantly, the delay Mitchell's deception had created, those critical hours when a battalion-strength enemy force remained stationary instead of advancing, allowed American forces to establish the defensive positions that would ultimately contain the southern portion of the offensive. That evening, in a hastily established command post, Mitchell sat with the other members of Second Squad, exhausted and processing what they had accomplished. Lieutenant Walsh, who had managed to extract the remainder of 1st Platoon, found them there. Walsh looked like he had aged 10 years in a single day, said the lieutenant, sitting down heavily beside Mitchell. "Corporal, I just finished debriefing with the battalion commander. They are estimating that the enemy force you held in place today numbered approximately 730 soldiers. Your action prevented them from advancing when we were most vulnerable. The battalion commander believes you and Second Squad saved at least 30 American lives, probably more." Mitchell had been too focused on survival to think about broader implications, said Mitchell quietly. "We were just trying to stay alive, sir. The rope trick, that was just something I remembered from hunting back home. Setting up decoys to fool deer." Walsh managed a tired smile, said the lieutenant. "Well, Corporal, you just used deer hunting tactics to fool an entire battalion. I suspect the Army is going to be very interested in talking to you about that." Over the following weeks, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, the story of Mitchell's rope deception spread through the division. Military intelligence officers interviewed him extensively, trying to understand exactly how 6 men with minimal equipment had created such an effective deception. The official after-action reports credited Second Squad's action with delaying an enemy advance by approximately 7 hours and preventing what could have been a catastrophic breakthrough. The estimates of enemy casualties from the artillery directed by their intelligence ranged from 70 to 100. Mitchell was promoted to sergeant and received a Bronze Star for valor, but he insisted that every member of Second Squad deserved equal credit. Sergeant Harrison would later write in his memoirs that Mitchell's actions represented the perfect example of individual initiative and creative thinking under pressure. Of the 32 men who had comprised 1st Platoon when the offensive began, 24 survived. Lieutenant Walsh always maintained that without the delay created by Mitchell's deception, his platoon would have been completely overrun in those critical first hours when American forces were most disorganized. The rope itself was left behind in the forest when Second Squad withdrew. Mitchell often wondered what happened to it, whether it remained strung between those trees as a silent witness to the deception, or whether enemy soldiers eventually discovered it and realized how thoroughly they had been fooled by such basic means. In the broader context of the Battle of the Bulge, Mitchell's action was a small footnote. But for the 30 American soldiers whose lives were saved because an enemy battalion remained stationary for crucial hours, and for countless others who benefited from the defensive positions that delay allowed to be established, Mitchell's rope deception represented something profound about the nature of warfare itself. Military historians who later analyzed the southern sector noted multiple instances where small unit actions by isolated American forces disrupted enemy timetables. Mitchell's deception was among the most creative, demonstrating how individual ingenuity could multiply force effectiveness far beyond what numbers alone would suggest. Mitchell himself rarely spoke about the experience after returning home. He went back to the mountains of Virginia, worked in the coal mines like his father, and raised a family. It was only late in life, when interviewed by a military historian, that Mitchell provided a full account of what had happened that day. The historian asked him to explain how he had conceived the rope deception under such pressure. Mitchell thought for a long moment before responding. He said, his voice carrying quiet conviction, "When you are hunting deer in the mountains, you learn that movement catches the eye more than anything else. A deer can stand perfectly still 20 feet from you, and you will walk right past it. But the slightest movement and your brain locks onto it immediately. I figured soldiers were not that different from hunters. They see what they expect to see, and if you show them movement where they expect the enemy to be, their imagination does the rest." He paused, then continued, "The rope was just a way to create movement without exposing my men. We did not have enough people to actually be in all those places at once, so we made the rope do the work for us. Add in some noise, some carefully placed shots, and let their own nervousness fill in the details. They saw what they feared was there, not what actually was there." That simple explanation captured the essence of what Mitchell had accomplished. He had understood that the psychological dimension of combat could be as important as the physical. The enemy soldiers in that valley were experienced, well-equipped and numerous, but they were also operating in hostile territory, already nervous from earlier contact, and predisposed to interpret ambiguous information as threatening. Mitchell had not defeated 700 soldiers with 6 men and a rope. He had simply convinced them to defeat themselves, to abandon their offensive posture, and waste crucial time preparing for a threat that existed primarily in their own assessment. In an era when warfare was increasingly dominated by industrial production and massive formations, Mitchell's action demonstrated that human creativity and individual initiative still mattered. The conflict would ultimately be decided by the side that could produce more weapons and field more soldiers. But within that framework, there remained room for individual soldiers to affect outcomes through intelligence, courage, and improvisation. As December 1944 gave way to January 1945, the story of Corporal Mitchell and his rope deception circulated through the ranks as both inspiration and instruction. It reminded soldiers that they were not helpless in the face of superior numbers, that creativity and terrain knowledge could multiply their effectiveness, and that sometimes the simplest tools, used innovatively, could achieve results that sophisticated weapons could not. The enemy offensive ultimately failed to achieve its strategic objectives. American forces, after initial setbacks, stabilized the line and counterattacked with the industrial might that characterized Allied operations in the final months. But in that critical first day, when the outcome remained uncertain and isolated, American units faced overwhelming odds. Actions like Mitchell's made the difference between catastrophic collapse and effective resistance. For Thomas Mitchell, the rope he had grabbed on impulse that cold December morning became a symbol of something larger than its physical form. It represented the value of preparation meeting opportunity, of practical skills applied to extraordinary circumstances, and of the difference that individual initiative could make. In the decades following the war, Second Squad held occasional reunions. At these gatherings, the members would inevitably recall that day in the Ardennes, the desperate improvisation, the hours of maintaining the deception, and the sheer relief when they finally reached friendly lines. They would laugh about details that had terrified them at the time, and remember with quiet respect those platoon members who had not made it home, and always someone would mention the rope. Mitchell, growing older but still possessing quiet confidence, would typically deflect the attention, crediting Harrison's tactical knowledge, Jensen's steadiness, or simple good fortune. But those who had been there knew the truth. They had witnessed Mitchell's creative genius under pressure, his ability to see possibilities where others saw only desperation. The historical record of World War II contains thousands of acts of individual heroism and creative tactics. Mitchell's rope deception earned its place in that record not because it was the most dramatic action, but because it perfectly illustrated the human dimension of warfare that no amount of industrial production could replace. As Mitchell himself noted in that late-life interview, the lessons from that day extended beyond military applications. He reflected, his words carefully chosen. "I learned that day that the tools do not matter as much as the thinking behind how you use them. I had a rope, some trees, and 5 other scared men. But I also had knowledge from hunting, understanding of how people react to uncertainty, and the absolute necessity of doing something rather than nothing. When you combine those elements, even simple tools can accomplish extraordinary things. That philosophy, born in desperate circumstances, served Mitchell well throughout his post-war life. He applied the same creative problem-solving to challenges in civilian life, always looking for unconventional solutions, always willing to attempt something audacious when conventional approaches failed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.